Hello, and welcome to another Northstar Talks Politics. Today I'm going to talk about something that both relates to my last video and also is a parallel to it, and that is immigration under socialism. Now, I previously talked about immigration under capitalism, explained how, in economic terms, it's often harmful to the working class under capitalism because it prevents labor shortages that would drive up wages under capitalism. That is, when the labor market starts to become tight, the high bourgeoisie, who can have the real power in capitalist society, and to a degree the petty bourgeoisie, because they are also employers, uh, push for loosened immigration to increase the labor force to keep the labor market from becoming tighter, and if possible, loosen it to keep wages down. This is not to say that immigration should be discouraged from a moral standpoint. Even if we live in capitalist societies, people should be able to search for better opportunities, to escape oppressive situations, to see the world. There are many, many reasons to encourage it, even under capitalism, of course. But it's important to realize that there is a fundamental disconnect and clashing of conflict of interests between what's best economically for the rich and the ordinary people under capitalism. However, socialism has different motivations, different forces. Now, let me be very clear here. Some of you who not follow my series have not uh, heard my explanations to these things before and do not know much political theory because, oh my God, there is so insanely much disinformation and propaganda out there about socialism, especially in the United States. Socialism is not government spends a lot of money. Socialism is worker control of the means of production. For those of you who start screaming that's communism or something, no, it's not. Communism is specifically Marxist Leninism. By the way, they did not call themselves communists. Marxist Leninists say they were building socialism. Communism is technically the name for the end goal, the utopia that might take hundreds of years to reach after hundreds of years building socialism. Communism has never been achieved, according to any socialist, Marxist, Leninist. Communism, as in the Communist parties, refers to the parties naming themselves based on the aspirational goal, but Marxist Leninists co opted the term, so you won't often see other socialists call themselves communist parties. They are all socialists. The Democratic Socialist Party, still socialist. The Party for Socialism and Liberation, an example of a party that is actually Marxist Leninist, specifically Marxist Leninist Maoists. They don't call themselves communists, they call themselves socialist. But they're actually, it's not meaningful that they don't call themselves communists because, again, socialism, communism, they both refer to work control of the means of production. Those who are not Marxist Leninists will often shy away from the term communist because, of course, that association with Marxist Leninists, and will emphasize I'm not a communist, I'm a socialist, because there are differences in ideas within socialism. But, anyways, under socialism, which includes Marxist Leninism, but is not limited to it, and I'm speaking from a non Marxist Leninist socialist perspective, democratic socialism, which is multi party democracy rather than democratic centralism combined with socialism, where you have nationalized industries or workers' cooperatives, because those are the two forms of organization generally utilized under socialism. There is a third, by the way, and that is where local towns and municipalities, rather than a nation, own businesses. This is a more local form of control than nationalization, but it is not the same as a workers' cooperative, and it's not just the people who work in a business who decide how that business is run, but everyone in the local community around it, which is important because things like air pollution and water pollution from business affect everyone in the town, not just the workers. And this ensures that things are done that benefit the community as a whole. Of course, there can be conflicts of interest between a local municipality and nation as a whole, Um, so it's a trade-off between internalizing all the externalities, to use an economic term, and having a more local center of control to ensure that democracy really thrives. But anyways, um, socialism, again, not high government spending. It's workers' cooperatives, uh, local ownership, or national ownership of business. Um, the abolition of private property. That is, private property is farms, mines, factories. It is not your car. It is not your house, unless you have a second house that you're renting out and not living in. That would be private property. So rental properties, farms, mines, factories, intellectual property, generally, um, you know, patents sometimes still exist under socialism, but you don't have these private equity firms that own all this IP and make money just off of owning IP they did not themselves invent. Um, so intellectual property is handled differently in their limits on its ownership under socialism. Anyways, to get back to the main topic, how is immigration handled under such a system? Very differently. Let me start off with a Google search and show you the insane amounts of propaganda. First of all, labor shortages in the USSR. Uh, you notice libcom, liberal. These are left comms. They are nothing but a probably likely CIA-funded misinformation source that tries to endlessly critique history. Soviet history, another CIA-funded source that puts up propaganda. Literally, CIA.gov. Uh, then you go to page 2, CIA.gov again, Investopedia. These are all extremely biased anti-socialist sources before you even get to the first really actual relevant unbiased article. And that's the Communist Soviet Union article on Wikipedia. There is the Soviet working class one. It's not biased, but it's not as relevant as this article. The Communist Soviet Union was a centrally planned economy, of course. Now, I think they actually term it saturation. Here we go. Saturation of unskilled workers. This is the first thing, and the reason I pulled up this article is to realize in the biggest socialist system ever existed, which was Marxist, Leninist, and centrally planned, so not the only way socialism can be done. But in the Soviet Union, there was a saturation of unskilled workers. That is to say that there was an inability to meet all the demands for unskilled workers. There were more jobs than there were people. What would be considered under capitalism and the terminology it uses an extremely, I'll leave this up for you guys, an extremely tight labor market. There was a scarcity of educated workers, even though the Soviet Union heavily invested in education. This was partly because they heavily invested in the creation of more educated jobs. Um, so again, a type of labor shortage, scarcity of educated workers, saturation of unskilled. These are both labor shortages. And on top of that, there was sometimes brain drain with people who got free education in the Soviet Union trying to leave the country and go to capitalist countries. They get paid more because in capitalist countries, education isn't free or isn't subsidized as much. Some European countries, it's free, but in the Soviet Union, they'd be doing much more to, say, support the cost of living of students. Some European countries have small stipends for students, but it's increasingly rare today. Um, and education was often, in many ways, placed off limits to people from lower classes. For instance, I'll give you an example of a country that technically has free university, but it's not really accessible. Romania today, capitalist Romania. They have standardized testing for university, and it's basically an exclusive system, or a lot of people get free college from the government. But because public education is terrible outside of just a few large cities, a lot of the population lives in more rural areas, which is a very large part of the Romanian population today in smaller cities. They are never able to compete effectively for these government scholarships. So effectively, children of the rich who live in the capital or go to private schools get free education from the government, but not the children of the working class. And that is an example of limited access to education. So that makes having a degree scarce, that or education being expensive, like is the United States, where it's ungodly expensive. And so workers with these skills are paid more than they would be in a socialist country where anyone can get a free education. So people get the free education, and then they move to uh, where the skills that they have are paid more highly because they're scarcer there, supply and demand. Um, Unfortunately, and that brings me to a point, supply and demand. One of the problems with the Soviet economy is, although it was socialist and centrally planned, the way the state-owned enterprises, which nationalized companies, were operated uh, was flawed. Uh, they operate in ways that in many ways mimicked capitalist enterprises in terms of creating a gap between the value workers produced and what they were paid. And part of that obviously was going into growing state-owned enterprises further or given to the government to pay for things like the military. Um, but part of it went to government and then was redistributed as welfare type benefits. Um, and this is problematic. And of course, some, like in any system, is lost to corruption. Um, if you think that's just because it went through government hands, I got news for you. Corruption exists in capitalist corporations where you have very often people will embezzle money from companies and the company will go under. This happens in housing developments. This happens in insurance companies all the time in the United States and in other countries. I, example, I remember watching the movie Tetris, and it tells us a historically accurate story. And this movie is somewhat biased against the Soviet Union, but less than most in capitalist countries. But the historically accurate story of this guy who is in charge of an intellectual property publishing and insurance company, I think, or something. That was like a financial giant in London, and he was embezzling tremendous amounts of money from the company before it went under. I also watched something that was about Japan. There was this housing developer who ran off with mass amounts of money in a luxury housing development. He embezzled it and fled the country. These things happen in private industry. It's not just government where there's corruption and theft. But regardless, money was brought to the federal government and some of it was redistributed as welfare type systems. Now, while obviously welfare is always to a certain degree necessary because you have, for instance, the disabled who can't work, so you can't expect them to be supported off of wages. Um, this often went to a lot of benefits, sometimes that were given to workers and um, led to too low of a wage for the workers, which led to the managers of the state-owned enterprises not investing enough in automation. I'm struggling, sorry for the exact words described, but some of these benefits were things like subsidized food for everyone, which is, of course, to prevent people from starving who, say, were less able to work because they had to do a lot of childcare, which was also subsidized, or were just not very intelligent or not capable of working many hours, kind of partial disability situation, various reasons, and to prevent any famines from occurring. Subsidized food, I believe this particular program was created partly in response to the history of the Holodomor. That is, to avoid anything like that ever happening again, food was subsidized by the government in the future because they didn't want famines. So that was their workers, and the Soviet Union had a labor shortage. People who villainized the Soviet Union, they didn't want to kill off their own workers because they needed those workers. Just like the Holodomor was not intentional. It was not a famine genocide. It was just a famine through ineptitude because they actually needed those people to serve as soldiers. A lot of Ukrainians served in the Red Army in World War II and to serve as factory workers, which had a shortage of factory workers. They never had enough of them. Um, there was ineptitude and there was racism by local bureaucrats, and some people received the death penalty for some of the crimes they committed against the local Ukrainian population. some Soviet bureaucrats, which is not something that's talked about, because when you start saying, well, this bureaucrat starved the people in this town, but then he was sent to the gulags and died there a few years later, then it starts to do a lot less to villainize the Soviets. By the way, gulags are just the Soviet prison system, technically, but when people say that, they usually refer to the forced labor camps in Siberia, which, of course, the Google search Soviet labor shortages starts talking about the forced labor camps, which have nothing to do with labor shortages, really. It's just CIA propaganda. And with labor shortages being a hot topic these days, there is so much of it. Some of it literally from CIA.gov. I showed you how 2 of the top search results were literally from the CIA website. But they also, through the National Endowment for Democracy and such, fund a lot of other misinformation. It's from other organizations, like I'm pretty sure Leftcom is actually funded by them. Yes, because the Soviet Union has a history. CIA has a history of funding Trotsky and Leftcom groups to disrupt Marxist-Leninists and democratic socialists, which they also worked to disrupt the Socialist Party of the United States, caused its breakup into like 3 parties, including the modern Democratic Socialists of America, which is not actually a party, but a caucus to some degree within the Democratic Party. That breakup was instigated by the CIA. And I think there was some FBI cooperation, but yeah, the security apparatus did that. It's document history that one of the lead people who actually helped found the Democratic Socialist America was a CIA asset. This DSA has thrived in spite of that guy's CIA connections, not because of them. Though they did overcome that, but the other two branches, because over the issue of the Vietnam War, the Socialist Party of America broke into 3 pieces, and the other 2 died off entirely. Anyways, so labor shortages existed in the Soviet Union. They also tend to occur in other socialist experiments. A lot of the Warsaw Pact countries, yes. At certain places and times, you saw labor shortages, though, in in actually China before the opening up. That was partly a lack of capital from abroad that could actually increase worker productivity, which freed up labor, which also modernization of farming. A lot of things would later lead to labor surplus instead of a shortage, but for a time there were labor shortages, especially when agriculture is very labor intense and they need a lot of people to produce enough food. I believe there was time periods in Cuban history, although Cuba's had a hard time importing the machinery to really put pressure on their labor supply, which is saying the U.S. has, of course, prevented nearly anything from flowing to Cuba through a series of sanctions and other often essentially illegal mechanisms to prevent trade with Cuba and to prevent Cuba from being able to get medicine, machinery, all sorts of things that are necessary for an economy to function properly. And then, of course, if things are bad there, they say, oh, it's because of communism, we must do regime change. No, the CIA, the State Department, and the U.S. government more broadly are directly responsible for these problems. The State Department is the sanctions, but the CIA also goes in and does sabotage. Famously, they actually sent guerrilla teams during the Cold War to blow up sugar mills in Cuba, for instance. So, yes, direct sabotage of industrial equipment and machinery, sanctions that make it harder to replace stuff. That's maybe not led to a tight labor market in Cuba. So, the discussion shifts to the Soviet Union, but it's a general principle. And God, I'm almost 20 minutes here. It's a general principle under socialism. You end up with labor shortages, not unemployment like you see in capitalism. And the reason for this, well, there's several. Capitalism has a natural tendency to create what Marx termed the reserve army of the unemployed, because the tighter the labor market becomes, the tighter wages become. Private employer profits go down as wages go up. So there's a phenomenon where there's a certain number of workers in a community, okay? And this is part of standard capitalist economics even. So, or in a region, there's a certain number of workers, and when you have unemployed workers, they depress wages. But if you start to hire all those people up, even if you're still getting more value of those workers, then you're paying them in wages because you have to compete for their labor. You end up offering them higher wages because companies often can't engage in discriminatory compensation. They can't pay some workers more than others for the same work. It's often illegal. What ends up happening is they have to raise wages for all the workers, and so they end up paying out more in additional wages than they're making additional value, even though every single one of their workers is producing them a profit because the margins of exploitation go down on all the other workers. So capitalism naturally tends to have unemployment. It will always have a certain percentage of the population unemployed, and what that percentage is varies on a variety of things, such as the state of automation, economic change, how saturated markets are, how much companies are able to, through mergers and acquisitions, buy up all the competition and form monopolies, which tend to lead to even higher rates of unemployment. You get the idea. Um, if you have a really bad situation, you have what's known as monopsony in the labor market, where there's always a single company that hires people in a field. And this leads to the highest rates of unemployment because they can artificially depress wages and choose not to obviously do any kind of competitive hiring. We have multiple firms that compete with workers for workers. That drives up wages. It leads to a state where there's lower equilibrium rates of unemployment than when you have just a single firm in a community. So, company towns will have higher unemployment rates in theory once they've stabilized. Initially, there's none because everyone who moves to company town is a worker, but over time, people get laid off, and if they're not kicked out of the town, the regions around company towns for sure have higher unemployment rates if people are kicked out of the town itself when they're not working for a company. Um, because of monopsony, which is monopoly is one seller, monopsony is one buyer. Anyways, and you tend to get more and more of both, by the way, in like the United States with increasing levels of market consolidation. But in socialism, as long as a worker is producing more value in wages, it's in the interest of a manager of a state-owned enterprise or a local community to hire them. And there, you want at least some gap to be able to grow the company, even if it's not going to enrich investors, because again, that doesn't exist in socialism. You don't have a group that's profiting off exploiting others' labor, but you do still need to grow a company. You need to be able to put something away for the future. So you still need a small gap at least for reinvestment. And yeah, as long as you can at least break even on a worker when you include those, if you add that to the cost of employing the worker in your calculus, you're going to hire people, tend to grow. If your worker's cooperative, same thing. Um, so the tendency is to employ all the available workers, at least anyone who's a decent worker and isn't going to sabotage your company. And the end result is labor shortages. Combine this with the fact that another thing that's rarely talked about is capital, that is the physical means of production, stuff like machines, um, intellectual property, all these different things, organizational systems increase productivity. Capital tends to accumulate in an economy over time as it develops, and as it does, there is a greater demand for labor for a given level of technology. You can see more creation of what's known as capital intensive jobs, jobs that require a lot of capital. This can be things like scientific research, can just be highly automated manufacturing jobs. There's a lot of different things, but you'll see more demand for capital intensive labor. Um, this is, of course, somewhat offset by seeing more automation technology work its way in. But socialist economies are actually better at growing their capital than capitalist economies, ironically. The Soviet Union saw a higher average long term GDP growth rate. Long term, mind you. So this is not averaging year to year, but this is looking at 5-year, 10-year periods. And when you take those and look at them, the Soviet Union saw a higher long-term GDP growth rate up until about like 72 than pretty much the entire capitalist world, exceeded only by France. And then when Nixon got rid of the Bretton Woods banking system, which greatly slowed economic growth all around the world and screwed over France in particular, Japan ended up the fastest growing economy, although the Soviets behind them. But they had a very, very high long-term GDP growth rate is the point, which is the production of a nation, the total production. And the Soviet population wasn't exactly skyrocketing. Um, Although people tend to have more children under socialism than their capitalism, all other things being equal, because they're less pressured just to survive. Uh, Soviet Union very heavily invested in women's education and rights, which tends to depress birth rates for reasons I think are fairly well understood. Women with PhDs don't have 6 kids, kind of thing. They wait till later in life, and sometimes they're less fertile because they waited till later in life. The availability of in vitro fertilization can somewhat offset that and other fertility treatments, but and there were some efforts then in the Soviet Union to the point of Romania banning abortion and heavily investing in fertility healthcare, for instance, which obviously that should not have happened. The banning of abortion, that was wrong, but that's something that happened because their birth rates were plummeting. Um, but yes, if the GDP is growing very fast and the population isn't growing very fast, and that says productivity is growing quickly, and the main way productivity grows quickly is through the accumulation of capital, which augments worker productivity, all other things being equal. And of course, if you have a large amount of production economy, whatever is not used directly to meet people's immediate needs will tend to go into growing the pool of capital as well. So you can also see from that um, this pretty basic fact, which is that socialist economies actually grow their capital faster than capitalist economies. In fact, for a long time, the Soviet Union took great pride in adding new factories and mines and such faster in the capitalist world relative to their level of development, because it did. It isn't just some made up thing. This is a fact. Um, and of course, new factories, new mines, new agricultural machinery, all these things, this tends to lead to more demand for workers. So you end up with labor shortage. Okay, that established, hopefully, because I don't have time to keep proving this or explaining this to you, because I sit here all day on just that topic, and when we get to the point of immigration. If you have a labor shortage and you have rapid growth of capital country, immigration is uh, incentivized for the government to want, but it's also something that's in the interest of ordinary people under socialism, because you don't have the same connection of labor supply and demand to wages. That is, whatever is not used for reinvestment should in theory be paid to the workers under socialism, or if it's not paid directly, is like in the Soviet Union collected and given and back out as welfare benefits. Um, of course, exempting what's either taxes or in-kind taxes for things like the military. The Soviet Union actually got rid of income taxes eventually, and instead relied on the net revenues of state-owned enterprises, which were just a kind of in-kind tax, and they would have actually been better off staying with income taxes. There's some economists who have criticized this, but um, whether you have income taxes or you do a state-owned enterprise type thing, the problem is, of course, the income taxes. How do you tax workers' cooperatives? And in the very late period of the Soviet economy, they actually switched to incentivizing workers' cooperatives, but they did not pay into the government budget because there were no income taxes. And you ended up with, I think there were some taxes supposed to target them, but they were easy to avoid. So workers' cooperatives didn't pay their taxes, and this helped uh, blow up the Soviet economy in the 80s. under Gorbachev's reforms. It was poorly implemented. It helped crash the Soviet Union. Meant that the government was in a tight financial situation at the same time that the reforms he introduced were creating massive political and economic disruptions. That was a bad situation, of part of what led to Soviet Union collapsing. In addition, most importantly, to a lot of people within the Soviet Union no longer believing in the system. But worker shortages, rapid growth of capital, immigration is rewarded. It's even the interest of ordinary people, because more workers doesn't mean wages go down like under capitalism, where an employer will pay workers as little as they can get away with. Socialism is generally just going to say, if it's a centrally planned economy, it's just going to say this type of labor is worth this much per hour. There's this adjustment factor for the quality of your work. Your manager can pay you more if you do better work, or you are more productive than your fellow workers, because that's something that happened under socialism. It was the basic summary of the socialism, including the Soviet economy, is from each according to his ability to each according to his work, or from each according to his work to each according to his work. That is, people were paid based on the work they did. It didn't matter if the labor situation was tight or loose, whereas in capitalism, your wages go up or down depending on how many competing workers there are. It mattered how much value you produce, which meant basically how long do you work, how hard do you work, and how skilled are you, and that determines what you're paid. Engineers were paid more than, say, ditch diggers, because they had more skills and they invested in themselves, and education was free, so anyone could become an engineer. In fact, there was a huge tendency of people to pursue education so they could get better jobs in the Soviet Union. Whether it was engineering or accounting, you had people who were born into illiterate peasant communities before the revolution, and they actually ended up becoming accountants, which is something almost unheard of in capitalist countries, because there wasn't nearly the same investment in education. It wasn't as accessible to ordinary people. Happens sometimes, but it's rare, except in absolutely booming economies in very specific situations where you might find similar stories. Anyways, thinking particularly of Brazil and India. So you don't compete with immigrants for labor under socialism, and there's still the humanitarian considerations. However, there is one thing the government has to worry about, and that's emigration. So immigration is often encouraged because socialist countries tend up with labor shortages. Emigration is often discouraged. So you can come, but it's discouraged leaving. People could leave, by the way, but there are often rules of like having to pay the government a fine, essentially, because you got a free education and you were a young worker who was leaving shortly after university, or certain types of extras being prohibited from leaving for a certain number of years after graduating from university. These things happened in the Soviet Union, and you could foresee other socialist countries, democratic ones, for instance, having the political parties vote to create such a law as well. This is something that might be more contentious, but could still, all sorts of laws can pass if, it becomes obvious it's in the interest of a country. I mean, the U.S. is technically a democracy and has all sorts of sometimes very messed up rules, like the exemption to university employment paying into payroll taxes that fucked me out of Social Security disability insurance that I thought I was entitled to, because, it's not like I sat studying the rules for SSDI my whole life. I just figured if I ever became disabled, which I hoped I never would, that at least the government had my back, but they didn't, because it's a fucked up system and politicians make laws that make it fucked up. Why is this relevant? I'm saying that whether a system is socialist or capitalist, politicians can make stupid rules. Immigration probably should not be discouraged, because it should be a basic human right to move about. But both capitalist and socialist countries will mess with these rights sometimes. Capitalist countries will tend to, when nationalism rises or the working class in that country starts identifying that they're competing with immigrants, will sometimes tend to restrict immigration. Socialist countries do the opposite. They tend to restrict emigration, so they tend to make it harder to leave and easier to come in because if there's a worker shortage, there's a lot of goods that aren't being produced. Uh, you can have firms that are struggling to meet key roles. There's a labor complementarity system, which is exaggerating and affecting capitalist countries because it's an interest of the bourgeoisie to have lots of immigration. So you get like Rand Corporation doing these bias studies that exaggerate that effect. But that effect still exists in socialism. And it without the competition of labor for limited amounts of labor for limited amounts of job and how that affects wages under capitalism. Without that effect, it's an interest oriented people to see that labor complementarity, to see foreign skills and new ideas come into a country. So, where does socialism stand on immigration? On migration, it tends to encourage immigration, discourage emigration. It tries to bring people in, tries to stop them from leaving if possible. Um, and ideally, a system would just give people complete freedom of movement. The economic incentives, however, push that way, and people, including even in democratic socialist countries, can sometimes be selfish pricks. Um, um, it's a question of people doing the right thing that's not in their own self-interest. For instance, to encourage their politicians to vote for a rule to make it easier to leave their country if their country is experiencing brain drain because they have free education in their country. Um, for people to not encourage their politicians to discourage immigration, to I'm saying for people to stand for the right thing rather than what's in their own self-interests. Well, I mean, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. Um, of course, the nice thing about a democratic socialist system as opposed to a democratic centralist, that is Marxist-Leninist socialist system, is you can have opposition parties that are still socialist because you can restrict the existence of capitalist parties, but you can have multiple socialist parties that are competing and some that may take the particular line of we need to allow more immigration and can form an opposition and make arguments. Unfortunately, the idea behind democratic centralism is that everybody should debate an issue, come to a common consensus, and work together. So we, quote, don't need opposition parties. That's the biggest flaw with Marxist-Leninism, is you don't have opposition parties. Um, and you have a single party, and that just opens itself to corruption. Socialism doesn't require just a single party, and there are socialist countries that have had multiple parties. Um, beyond the very nascent democratic socialist systems that were quickly crushed by the CIA, like Chile, it's worth noting a system that's not even democratic socialist, but does have multiple parties. North Korea, they actually have something like 13. Uh, Unfortunately, one party there wins like 75% of the vote every time, and the other parties are mostly small regional parties that represent local interests, or in the case of one party, a particular religious group's interests. So they're more like narrow interest parties rather than serious competition for holding power. There is still one party that has a near monopoly on actual ruling power, and just exists in coalition with these local regional parties in North Korea. So that's not obviously a democratic socialist aim for. They aim for, 5, 6 socialist parties. They're all competing for different ideas of how to run the country, but they're all socialist. Um, you could have capitalist parties, but the problem is foreign interests um, coming in and secretly supporting those parties, growing them for an election interference, that kind of thing. So sometimes some democratic socialists argue we should allow capitalist parties, other argue you shouldn't. But either way, you want many, many socialist parties that are competing with each other, because competition in politics can be good, can also be bad. It depends on how it works, what the rules on the ground are. Um, that's why things like proportional representation are a great thing. Systems that require coalitions to form can be a good thing, as opposed to more winner take all political systems, which create unhealthy types of competition. There's healthy and there's unhealthy competition. And this is true within democracies or republics, if you prefer to call it that. So, a socialist republic would ideally structure its system to encourage coalitions, to make sure that even parties that don't get a lot of votes still get some seats, hence proportional representation, to have things like ranked choice voting. These things are all important for any healthy republic. By the way, the US desperately needs proportional representation and ranked choice voting, even if it doesn't have socialism. You can still have these systems in place to prevent a two-party duopoly, where there's just two parties that hold all the power in the U.S. and it's impossible to really form a third. I mean, you have third parties, but they can't get any traction because you have a spoiler effect, and that's what happens. You have winner take all to its most extreme version, like in the U.S. with political power. Anyways, um, so yeah, the point I wanted to make is that the incentives and the economic situation with regards to immigration is very different under socialism. After pointing out that under capitalism, you do see the problems of population not shrinking when it otherwise would when you bring in immigrants. And if the population shrinks, it creates a labor shortage because firms don't necessarily need fewer employees just because you have fewer people. There can be a variety of reasons. Firms can be making goods for export, so it's not based on local consumer demand. There can be things where they're making goods for a market that is not saturated. So even if demand for their goods decreases as the population shrinks, there's still more need for the goods than production. This can be true of things that there's a shortage of, like housing. In the US, there's a housing shortage. The population shrinks. You're not going to see fewer construction workers because there's still going to be more demand for housing than there is supply of it for quite a while. The population can shrink quite a bit without leading to a decrease in construction employment. There's also fields that you could theoretically employ a limited number of people in, like scientific research, and the employment that really just depends on the government budget. And if a lot of other fields are not shrinking their employment, government revenues aren't necessarily going to go down that much because tight labor markets, higher wages, higher income taxes, and higher wages tend to lead to increases in productivity, which capital invests in productivity more and wages are high, which leads to higher tax revenue per person. So scientific research may not see as big a decrease in employment as the population shrinks. So the point being, in capitalism, ideally workers from an economic standpoint would want the population to shrink to create labor shortages. Under socialism, you'd want the opposite, lots of immigrants. Humanitarian, we should encourage immigration regardless. I think people and emigration should be allowed both. And what's nice about socialism is the incentives line up with the right thing to do, at least on the immigration issue, with the caveat that it flips, and no longer do you have problems with getting politicians and ordinary people to support immigration under socialism. Now the problem gets to be getting people and politicians to support immigration, and laws that make it easy to leave a country, and that's the whole another can of worms. Which is to say, no system is perfect, but I thought this was worth examining. Um, da, 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 stuff about food imports in the Soviet Union. There's some obvious tainting of even Wikipedia because anyone can edit it towards an anti-socialist perspective. But just to, if you saw that on that article when I pulled up real quick, it's worth knowing the Soviet Union was, mostly modern day Russia. It was a cold climate, and further south it had areas of Kazakhstan desert. It was not very productive land agriculturally. The only really fertile areas were Ukraine and Poland, and Poland was very terribly run by the Warsaw Pact um, government. It wasn't actually part of the Soviet Union proper. It was, the Polish Socialist Republic, or whatever. And Ukraine was the only real breadbasket of the Soviet Union. So, and a little bit of Central Russia. So they had trouble producing enough food, which, by the way, also helped create labor shortages. It's worth noting because if your land can, if you're struggling to produce enough food, you're going to try and throw more labor and money at the problem to try and produce enough food, because relying on food imports is a dangerous thing. And in fact, the US played games with allowing food imports and then suddenly cutting them off to the Soviet Union. I have a family member who loves to talk about this and say, "Oh, it's so clever the U.S. did this." Like, you're literally playing with people's ability to eat. So while Soviet workers generally actually consumed more calories than they needed and close to the level of Americans, there was some variability where some years the U.S. would suddenly cut off wheat imports for a year and people would not have enough food for a little while. Um, if the grain reserves start to run low, anyways, because grain doesn't last forever in a granary. Um, Granary, now I'm thinking like civilization, a food storage facility. So, yeah, it might not be the same if, say, the U.S. went socialist, because the U.S. has abundant fertile agricultural lands with regards to, agricultural labor, and very little of the U.S. population works in agriculture, and there wouldn't be a need to throw more in, because it's not like the rest of the world cutting the U.S. off from food imports. If, the capitalists work together against the U.S., they probably wouldn't, because the U.S. is too powerful to try and isolate that way, much more than the Soviet Union ever was. Um, but it's not like that would result in the U.S. throwing labor at the problem to try and grow enough food, because the U.S. has an easy time growing enough food, and it's fat to net food exporter. Uh, Minor aside. Anyways, viewers, I wish you all the best. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. And may you always find guiding star lead you home. Until next time, this is Northstar. Adieu, and best luck.